Melissa Bernard from the America Votes opposes this piece of legislation and she wishes to speak. Melissa, would you please come forward and address the committee?
Good morning, Senator Barnes, members of the committee. My name is Melissa Bernard and I'm here representing America Votes. For those of you who are not familiar with us, America Votes is a nonprofit organization that, among other things, works to expand access to the ballot, coordinate issue advocacy and election campaigns, and protect every American's right to vote. I will not read my testimony in its entirety, but there are a few important points I would like to make. We are here today in opposition to Senate Bill 289, a bill under which voters would be required to present photo identification in order to obtain a ballot to cast their vote. While we respect the work that Senator Prescott and others put into this bill and appreciate the opportunity to comment, we continue to be concerned that implementation of ID requirements are costly and unnecessary. While this bill works to ensure that every qualified voter is able to cast their ballot on Election Day, it falls short of that principle and creates burdens that will fall most heavily on traditionally disenfranchised populations. We believe two important components missing from this legislation are, number one, a robust plan to educate the public regarding such a major change to New Hampshire voting laws, and number two, a training program for election officials. Without these components, such legislation is likely to create lines, confusion, and chaos at the New Hampshire polls. We consider this change to be a significant change in our election procedures, and it needs to be clearly communicated to the public, and our largely volunteer force of election administrators need to be properly trained before even a so-called soft implementation of this bill should be considered. Some of you may remember just the rumor that New Hampshire had passed voter ID led to problems in a very low turnout special election last year. The rollout, training, and implementation should be standardized across the state, and this legislation does not provide the needed clear guidelines for local officials. The last point I'd like to make is regarding cost. This legislation is likely to cost millions of dollars, and it is unclear how the sponsors plan to pay for this significant change in the conduct of elections in New Hampshire. I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Melissa. Questions from anyone in the committee? Senator Booth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Melissa, for your testimony today. I'm reading your testimony here, and I'm trying to understand, and maybe you can explain this for me further. You're right, when you look at the practical effect it would have, and I'm assuming you mean photo identification requirement, on an overall voting population, you will discover unintended effects. And that is the central reason that as an organization that works to protect voter access to the ballot, every America Vote is opposed to this bill. Now, can you explain what you mean by unintended effects, particularly in light of the fact that the bill has been stated by the City and Town Clerks Association, it's been stated by the Secretary of State office, it's been stated by Senator Prescott that no one will be disenfranchised, no one will go to the ballot and be turned away. So I'm trying to understand, and in particular, what are those unintended effects that you see will be present if this bill is passed?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. I appreciate the opportunity to illustrate what I mean by that. In looking at this type of legislation, and we've carefully looked at proposals in New Hampshire and also photo identification requirements around the country, there's a term called voter suppression, and that is voters who may not have the full picture, may not understand the ins and outs of the legislation. They may hear that there's a photo identification requirement, and they may think, oh, I don't have photo ID. You know, maybe I'm 85 years old, and so I'm not going to bother asking my daughter to drive me to the polls because now I need a picture ID and I don't have one. So that ties into our suggestion that should the legislature move forward with this bill, that a robust public education component does need to be incorporated so that the electorate is clearly informed of the election procedures in the state.
Mr. Chairman.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Well, that's a good point, and I would just refer you back to the bill where there is the Voter Advisory Committee, and there's some very specific language for Secretary of State's office and city and town clerks to robustly notify the public about the new law. And in fact, if you go on websites in other states, Secretary of State websites, you will see some, and I assume we will have this on our website similarly, very clear discussion and explanation of the photo ID and what's required and what the voters can do to make sure that they have the ability to vote without being disenfranchised. The other point, and follow up, Mr. Chairman, again, the other point is, it seems to me, and maybe you can explain where you get your figures, because the Secretary of State did not suggest that this was going to cost millions of dollars as you have. Can you give us some reason? Where are you getting your numbers from? Where do you get this millions of dollars?
It is our hope that if the legislature pursues this legislation, it will look at some of the suggestions that were made here today, one of which is that the public education component does need to be expanded. In looking at legislation that has been considered in other states, there's at least one state that in order for the legislation to stand court scrutiny, the state needed to institute mass media communication. They were required to run primetime TV ads to let the electorate know about the change in voting procedures. With those increased costs, I do believe that the state would be looking at incurring millions of dollars to implement this bill.
Melissa, thank you very much for your testimony. Yes, I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A witness brought up so-called O'Keefe incident, and I wonder if you might comment on your interpretation of what that demonstrates or doesn't, and also perhaps make sure that we all understand where the investigation associated with that stands at this point. And I apologize if this was already discussed in detail. I was over at my prime sponsor vote.
Thank you for the question, Senator. As you can tell, I think that there's a significant amount of attention being paid to this issue, and certainly the incident with Mr. O'Keefe and his videotaping effort during the New Hampshire primary has caused a lot of people to turn their attention to this bill. I believe the question for policymakers is not, the question for policymakers isn't, can voter fraud happen? The question is, does it? And O'Keefe decided, and his folks who participated in that effort, they decided to commit voter fraud in New Hampshire. It's my understanding that they were given a financial contribution to do that videotaping during the New Hampshire primary. We do not believe that proved anything with that video. Even with photo identification, the possibility of voter fraud will be present. The question is not can it happen, but does it happen? I think I heard someone give the example, O'Keefe could have robbed a bank to show that it's possible. And I was thinking about that this morning. So it's possible to rob a bank, but are we going to put up a security line so that anytime you want to go in and cash a check, you have to go through a metal detector or show your driver license? I think we're at the point where we need to put our trust in the voters of New Hampshire rather than make it much more difficult, if not impossible, to exercise the right to vote.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony this morning. Would you agree that it adds a level of integrity to the process, since no one is going to be disenfranchised?
Our position remains, Senator, thank you for the question. Our position remains that New Hampshire has some of the strictest voter registration procedures in the country. Voter registration must be done in person with an election official, and our system works. By and large, people have trust in the process.
Thank you, Melissa.
No more questions.
Senator Booth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Melissa, I just want to ask you, are you aware that this legislature, and there's been different players over the years, but this legislature has been working on voter photo identification since 1998. So I just want that clearly understood so that the media doesn't walk away today with the belief that this is a knee-jerk reaction to what Veritas did, but in reality, this is something that this legislature has been working on for years. And Senator Prescott has found a way to bring it all together and to bring the parties together to a bill that's reasonable and will work for the state of New Hampshire. Would you agree?
I am aware that the legislature has been working on this issue for a number of years, Senator.
Okay.
I think we all understand where American Vote stands on this issue. Thank you very much for coming in. You haven't been here since 1998, but you've been here for a good number of years. We have a Regina, and I apologize. My understanding of the last name is not good. Regina supports the bill but doesn't wish to speak. Is that correct, Regina? No? Okay. I'm going to go to Ted Loxamar from Greenfield, who supports the bill. I don't know, he didn't say whether he wanted to speak or not. So if he's not coming forward, we're going to assume he didn't want to speak. We are now going down to Sylvia Gale from the AFSC dash. Can't make out what the rest of it is. Are you here, Sylvia?
I am here and I do not wish to speak, but I
You do not wish to speak.
Do
You
not.
oppose the piece of legislation now. Still
That's
oppose the piece
that's
of...
American Friends Service Committee, by the way? We oppose.
Sam Langley. Sam opposes the bill. Sam, will you do me a favor?
Yeah,
We've heard a lot of testimony, and if you can add to it, please do it, and if you can't, would you please,
I'm gonna make it very quick.
because we have people out here lined up for the next bill, and we have a lot of people here that wish to speak, and you and I have had dealings over the last number of years, so I know what happens occasionally. So the committee would appreciate it, hit it, and what hasn't been heard, and please let somebody else move in. Thank you, Sam.
I oppose. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For the record, Sam Lang, this is Boss Blank. I oppose the bill because I think it's trying to kill a fly with a shotgun instead of a fly swatter. I don't think it's a big problem. We've got to remember that phony IDs can be bought on the street corner almost any time, so I don't think it's going to solve the problem, and I don't think it's a big problem. I will add this one thing. The amendment to the bill makes the bill far better than the original bill.
We thank you for that.
But I would still prefer I still think it's overkill. Having said that, any questions?
Sam, duly noted, and thank you so much for coming down. Charles Balba from the NHARA opposes the bill and wishes to speak. Charles, are you still here?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning.
Can you tell us what those initials represent?
New Hampshire Alliance for Retired Americans, non-profit organization. I'm president of that organization.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we do oppose this bill. I'm going to be very brief here for a couple of reasons. One is that the voter fraud, if any, is very slight in the state of New Hampshire. I would suggest that if any bill be brought forward, that would bring up a penalty for those who would commit to voter fraud as opposed to putting an extra burden on some of the people here in the state of New Hampshire. Namely, the people in extra care facilities, which number somewhere around 8,500 people. We've got 169,000 New Hampshire residents in the state of New Hampshire over the age of 65. It's been suggested that through community efforts that we take care of our disabled and retirees. And with that having been said, I will state that not everybody has a group to take care of them or a person to take care of them. And I can testify that I am one of those people. I have had to resist going for treatments to the hospital, which would require my having to have somebody bring me home other than a taxi cab driver, other than somebody other than a friend or family, because that's just the way certain procedures call for. I've had to resist going for treatments that my doctor prescribed because I didn't have anybody. I'm only 59 years old. We have people that are quite a lot older than I am that do not have anybody, a support group. So to add any extra burden to those people, to have to go any place, or to have to deal with any extra paperwork above and beyond what they're already burdened with, to me, doesn't make sense. It would be, in my mind, it would be more or less penalizing these people, the good people that have voted theoretically their whole lives, because of the bad guys. If anything, we should be penalizing the bad guys if they get caught. In this case, we're talking about voter fraud. So one hell of a good penalty on those people as opposed to throwing an extra burden on the good people of this state that would like to go out and vote without any extra paperwork or fees or worry about transportation. With that being said, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you for coming in to testify.
Thank you.
The committee appreciates it. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much. I have a Mary Ellen Pelletier, perhaps, who supports the bill and doesn't wish to speak. Is that correct? All right, thank you. I have a Ryan Donnelly, Granite State Independent Living, opposes the bill and wishes to speak. Ryan, good to see you again.
Well, thank you. I know we are running out of time here, so I would just like to pass out some written testimony that I have and state that I am here on behalf of Granite State Independent Living and that we oppose this legislation. People before me who have testified have gone over a number of the same issues I'm going to present, so I won't take up any more of your time, but thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate all the work that's gone into this legislation.
As always, we appreciate you coming in to testify.
Thank you.
I have I can't make the, sure. Representative Timothy Horgan. He opposes the piece of legislation, but he doesn't wish to speak. I have Michael Skibby, Disabilities Rights Center, who opposes the bill, and he does wish to speak, and that is you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
Mike Skibby from the Disabilities Rights Center. We do oppose the legislation because it's our belief that this is the kind of procedure that, although it's obviously the result of a lot of work and is intended to be narrowly tailored, we do think that it will tend to single out people with disabilities. It will tend to delay their time at the polling place. It will tend to discourage them from going through that process. And we think that that almost inevitably will suppress the vote of the people with disabilities to some extent. I don't think anybody can say to what extent, just like I don't think anybody can say with confidence that that this legislation will not disenfranchise anybody. Obviously, we're all speculating about how this is actually going to happen. But I think that we all know from our own experience, or many of us know from our own experience with elderly relatives, friends, or relatives with disabilities, that that the more hassle that is associated with activities, going out, going to a medical appointment, going out shopping, any of those things, the less likely they are to engage in it. And I think that it's pretty well understood that if you delay the voting process, the vote is suppressed across the board. That if there are lines extending out from a polling place, that some people are going to drive by and not stop. And I think you're much more likely to have that kind of an impact on the population of people with disabilities in New Hampshire. And we think that if you compare that inevitable result with the fact that we don't have a demonstrated problem of voter fraud, I think that it's unwise to pass this legislation. I think that that we heard about the concern about impact on the elderly, I think it's important to just get an idea of what the scale is of people who have the kinds of disabilities that make it difficult for them to get photo identification. I've seen estimates that say that about a quarter of the people over 65 don't have licenses, more than a third of those over 75. For people of all ages in New Hampshire, the rate of ambulatory disability is almost 6%. So it's a pretty significant portion of our population that has a disability that could put them in this sort of category of having to go through this alternative process. And it's a process that for some people will be embarrassing. They're being singled out in a public place, having to have their photograph taken. Some of those people are probably going to choose not to vote, and that's a bad policy judgment, I think, when we don't really have a problem that needs to be addressed here. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for coming down.
Thank you, and thank you for coming in. Can you give us any sense on the number of individuals that are considered to be disabled that wouldn't have some sort of a photo ID?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of
Could
your
you give
question.
us a sense of the percentage of individuals that wouldn't have a photo ID that's disabled?
Well, I think that, let me see if I did pull out some statistics, but I wasn't going to walk you through all of them. I can tell you that about 2% of the adult population, 1.7%, are either blind or experience a serious difficulty seeing even with the use of glasses. Those people probably don't have driver's licenses. Over 4% of our adult population needs assistance in getting medical appointments, so that's some scale of what...
Excuse me for just a second. I don't think that's answering the senator's question.
Do they have any other form of ID, a photo ID?
I don't know the answer to... I don't know that anybody has done a comprehensive study to determine what the sort of rate of photo identification other than driver's licenses are. I think that it's probably a pretty low number of those people that would have a passport.
Well, you all set?
Thank you.
John? Yeah, just because I can't. When you go to shopping centers, supermarkets, places like that, and you see people who are disabled with wheelchairs or other ambulatory systems and so forth and so on. What is the difference between when they have to stand in line or sit in line for 10 minutes waiting to go through to get their groceries done, than if they have to stand in line for a minute to get through to get their ballot to go vote? It seems to be well over exaggerated. So I possibly you could explain that to me.
I don't think that there's any question, just as a historical fact, that when the weather's bad, when there are long lines at polling places, some people decide not to vote. I don't think that there's any question about that. And so I think that maybe that there are other activities where we see people with disabilities waiting in lines, but I don't think that that really speaks to the problem here, which is that when you single out a segment of the population for a longer, for some people more embarrassing process, some of those people will choose not to engage in that activity. Now, maybe you or I, if we had that kind of a disability, would be determined enough to go through that process and vote. But I think that it's just intuitively obvious that some people will choose not to go through that. And so some of those people with disabilities will not vote. And I think that's not where we want to be in this state.
Senator Merrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Just to follow up on Senator Booten's question about the different scenarios. I mean, isn't one basic difference that everybody has to eat, but you don't have to vote? Although we would certainly hope that people will make every effort to vote, but I think that's a key difference between those situations. Waiting in line to vote.
That can certainly be discussed when we go into executive session between the two of you. I think you'll have a good discussion.
Whether it's necessary.
I think you two will have a very good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Crook TV.